Randy, that was beautiful. Appreciate it. Speaking on behalf of our family, I want to express our sincerest thanks to all of you for coming today to pay your respects to my father, who was a husband, brother, brother-in-law, dad, uncle, grandfather, and great-grandfather. We know him as family, but so many of you knew him as something else, either a patient, friend, neighbor, teacher, coach, colleague, assistant principal, maybe even a relationship personal to you that I'm not even aware of. So I hope that somewhere in my shared thoughts today, you find representation of how James Hubbard connected with you, and that you can remember with affection the encounters that may have brought you together for whatever reason your paths crossed. The day after Dad died, Kristen shared with me a school video project which she interviewed him on tape. And the first question kind of stumped him, so I could tell she didn't give him the questions ahead of time. So she said, "What is the best thing about your family?" And so, he kind of paused there for a couple of minutes, and he said, "Well, it's a pretty good family." And when I think about that quote, that's really, it hit home, because spending over 30 years as an educator gave him a lot of perspective on what good families look like. And that genuine answer says a whole lot about him. I know exactly what he meant, because one of my most vivid memories of my dad occurred when we had a large family gathering at the old Quincy's restaurant in Jasper. And some of the relatives in this room will remember that day, like I do. We were celebrating the 60th anniversary of my parents, my grandparents, Albert and Maxine Hubbard. I'm sorry, I forgot my glasses. At some point, Dad decided that he wanted to say something to the family as a group. Now, public speaking was not something that he was very polished at, and this was not a football halftime speech that he was giving. Though he was nervous and he was a little bit out of his element. But what I specifically remember is him thanking his parents for the siblings, or for the example that they set for him and his siblings, and how proud he was to be their son. He went on to say how proud he was that we had not had any divorces in the family, nor pregnancies, or drug users, or arrests, and that maybe a few other vices too. And at that time, all of that was true. And Keith and I have even laughed over the years about what happened afterwards for some of us. But the point is that he absolutely loved his mother and father and his brothers and his sister. And by extension, he loved Mom and me and my brother, our kids and grandkids, and anything family related. Times were not easy for them growing up, and they were not wealthy people. He and his sister Jean argued and fought a lot, especially over who was going to have to go to bed first to warm it up. Had frequent dirt clod fights when they were supposed to be working in the garden for my granddad, often resulted in whippings for both of them. Dad loved horses, mules, and dogs, and this love for animals carried over to adulthood, even though Aunt Jean often told us that he swore he would never farm when he could finally grow up and escape it. Dad's two brothers were 6 and 8 years younger than him, so Mackie and Larry saw him as an older big brother going places and doing big things in sports, paving the way for them to see the path to becoming the great athletes they became later too. Just a few weeks ago, in one of their last visits to see Dad, Mackie told Mom that James was my hero. It is remarkable that all three of them are now enshrined as brothers in the Fayette County Sports Hall of Fame. I have wondered often about how Dad became interested in football, since Granddad had only played basketball and baseball growing up. But something about football drew him in. Maybe it was the physically demanding elements of the sport. Maybe it was the toughness required to be good at it, the team concept involved, or maybe it was the influence of Coach J.B. McClendon, who identified the young kid at Fayette High as having a lot of potential. Regardless, he flourished as a football player and was named to All-State and All-American football lists as a senior, even though he was only 5'8", about 165 pounds. The Birmingham paper ran an article the summer after his senior year about his preparation for playing in the state All-Star game, describing how Grandpa Hubbard borrowed some pads from Coach McClendon so he and Dad could go out in the pasture and hit on each other to prepare for the game. And it paid off because he was named Offensive MVP for his performance. Lifelong friends, a relationship I'm sure many of you in this room can identify with as Dad's former players. Dad went on to play 2 years of junior college football at Itawamba, made All-American again, and finished his football career at Delta State College in Cleveland, Mississippi. He still holds a record for the longest kickoff return in school history during a bowl game for them. I've spoken with football players who played both with and against Dad in high school, and the comments were usually similar. Very fast, extremely competitive, and pound for pound the toughest guy on the field. After college, he played a couple of years of semi-pro football with the Tuscaloosa Warriors, a team which had quite a few former Alabama and Auburn players on it. After coaching a few years in other places, Dad arrived at Curry in 1965 as the head football coach. I've heard his players talk about him winning sprint races against them as a coach in his 20s or showing off his pull-up abilities in PE classes when kids struggled to get 1 or 2 done. Apparently he could crank out 50 or so fairly easily. What I remember about him as an athlete was that he was country strong without lifting weights and had forearms like Popeye. Sometimes we would tease him about his skinny legs, and he would always say, "Did you ever see big legs on a racehorse?" He would come home after farming all day on Saturday, get out of his truck, drenched in sweat, and join me in shooting baskets still in his overalls and boots. With no practice at all, he would start just making one shot after another, muscle memory coming back instantly, and he would just laugh at how easy it was to beat me at horse or free throw competitions. I also remember him being around 60 years old and grabbing a baseball bat in the backyard and Clay and I pitching to him and him just spraying line drives all over the yard like it was nothing. Hand and eye coordination was amazing. Came easy to him. Some of you probably remember driving by our house when he was nearing 70 years old and him sitting on a bucket in the yard catching Katie's left-handed softball pitches as she threw 55 miles an hour from 43 feet away and the ball moving everywhere. Not an easy task, but he did it every day to help her improve and succeed. He also learned to play golf in his 20s when he was coaching in Florida, and he played frequently during his coaching years in the summers with Mr. Short at Twin Lakes Golf Course. He developed a very good short game, and almost every time that I played with him, he would find a way to chip one in from off the green during the round. And then he would laugh, that big old belly laugh of his, knowing how frustrating it was for me that he always pulled that off because I wanted to beat him at something. When the granddaughters came along later, we did yearly family trips to Gulf Shores, and the girls went to the beach while Dad, Clay, and I played golf at different courses there. Some of my fondest memories of times with him were at the golf course, and he continued to play occasionally until late in his 60s. Anyone who has ever played golf with Clay knows how he swings. I see you, Todd. And if Clay ever mishit a ball or topped one badly, Dad would just not even crack a smile and just say, "Son, I just don't think you're swinging quite hard enough." He was really funny in the moment. We even took a memorable trip to the Masters in Augusta with Keith and Clay. Dad really enjoyed it, even though security made him give up his pocket knife at the gate. When I reflect on Dad's role in my sports life, I don't remember him ever saying anything really positive or negative after a game about games I participated in. I remember him teaching me how to throw and punt a football and how to dribble and shoot a basketball, but he never really offered suggestions or advice after games in my high school career. This is really surprising when I think about it. I guess he thought I would seek out his advice if I wanted it. He never coached my little league teams, probably because he was still actively coaching high school football, but he did coach Clay in baseball and later in junior high football when they didn't have a coach. I thoroughly enjoyed being a coach's kid, being on the sidelines, at practice, pep rallies, and riding the bus to and from games. It was a great life. I didn't always understand that sometimes his decisions might result in criticism or people being angry or upset at him, but that was definitely part of it. It was also not easy being the son of the assistant principal who was doing all the discipline at school, so I didn't go around advertising who I was for fear that the rough kids would find me. I will say though, and Clay said the same thing, that our friends often told us that Dad had disciplined them for something, and that at least they thought he treated them fairly and listened to their concerns. It takes good people skills and empathy to be remembered that way by your students. He never said anything to me about grades or anything school related, never felt any pressure to achieve in sports or school, but I sure didn't want either to disappoint either one of my parents and let them down. I too, like Mackie said, saw Dad as a heroic figure. The plaques on the wall celebrating his accomplishments in football were both an inspiration to Clay and I to strive to achieve, and they're also somewhat daunting to know that we could accomplish an awful lot and still fall short of all the things he had done in his career. But as his sons, we were proud nonetheless. The great preacher Billy Graham once said, "A coach will impact more people in 1 year than the average person will in their whole lifetime." In recent years, many of his former players have come by and visited or called and shared stories of ways that he impacted their lives or taught lessons through football that they still use today. I've heard his former players tell some funny stories from his coaching days at Curry. Apparently, his one slip of a curse word occurred when he told the team he was tired of hearing about the damn Blue Devils prior to playing Curry's bitter rival, Cordova. I can relate, as any of you who played at Curry and wore blue and gold can. Another one that I really enjoyed was hearing about him giving a really passionate halftime speech trying to motivate the team to a win when one of the scrub players who never got on the field raised his hand and said, "Hey coach, what time does that homecoming dance start tonight?" Coaching is a demanding profession and it's not for everybody, but I'm sure he would have coached longer if it was just dealing with players and fellow coaches. He loved his players and the coaches he worked with, and many of you have remained his friends to this day. Another thing that is interesting about his era in coaching is that even though some of them were bitter rivals, they were friends outside the football season and socialized with each other and their families. I don't think coaches do that much today. Our family was very honored by the turnout 6 years ago at his 80th birthday party. Although he was already starting to lose some of his cognitive function, I know he enjoyed hearing your stories and interacting with each of you. For me, the most special part of that event was having my daughters and my grandkids get to see Mom and Dad for the impact they had on the Curry community, not as grandparents, but as coaches and teachers. We greatly appreciate Principal Eric Woodley and Curry High School naming the football field for him in 2022. And how many people are in 2 halls of fame and have a football field named for them? Because I didn't want to leave anybody out, I didn't specifically list any particular players, assistant coaches, teachers, or principals that Dad worked with over the years, but please know how important each of you was to him. He loved his time at Curry High, and this community has been a wonderful home for us for almost 60 years. After Dad retired in 1994, he spent a lot of time working in our garden here in Curry and growing crops and having animals at his farm in Fayette. He loved working with animals, using mules to plow garden rows and to skid logs in the woods. He always said that the mules didn't tear up the woods the way a tractor would. He loved the agricultural, rural life, raising hogs for processing, growing a big garden with Mom, and even using an old-fashioned mule-driven press to make sorghum molasses in the primitive way. He absolutely loved tomatoes and would just sit and eat one after another every day. Couldn't get enough of them. He also loved homemade vanilla ice cream, and he swore to me that it tasted better when it was hand-cranked, not made by one of those electric makers that circled around. He would often have a bowl or two first before he even told the rest of the family that it was ready. The hospice staff can attest that he could consume 3 or 4 milkshakes a day in his final 2 years, and that's probably what kept him alive for as long as he lived. He and Mom often visited Amish families near Lawrenceburg, Tennessee, and they became very close friends. He appreciated their simple lifestyle and connection with the land and country values, The Amish lady sent his favorite meal home with us when I took Mom to visit them a few months ago. And the quilt that you see over the casket today was made by those special Amish ladies. As a grand and great-grandparent, I'm sure all the kids will remember PawPaw for jumping on the trampoline with him, dancing around the kitchen doing the Macarena, assigning all of them nicknames that he thought were funny, but they probably didn't. And Kristen, I won't share with anybody what yours was. He was also the one who they could go to for money when Grandma said no, and they benefited from him being in the fourth quarter, as he called it, when he reached the age where he was just about done dealing with any family drama. And Dad, I'm at the age now where I know exactly what you meant by that. In other words, he just quit sweating the small stuff and enjoyed life. He loved family gatherings in Fayette at Christmas, where he always got to be Santa Claus and hand out all the cash envelopes. He loved 4th of July parties and laughing heartily with his brothers and poking fun at the in-laws who had married into the family. He stayed involved in kids' sports activities, offering instruction when needed, and was always supportive and encouraging, and most important, he was present. Because of family dynamics and work schedules, my parents had a much bigger role than traditional grandparents in the lives of Katie and Kristen as they were growing up, and then in turn as their own children have come along. Thankfully, Clay's life journey has kept him in close proximity to Mom and Dad, and I'm grateful for that. Although the great-grandchildren have only known him a short time, the outpouring of love and affection they have seen from the community has shown them that their PawPaw was a beloved person that influenced and impacted many people. I feel compelled to express gratitude publicly to my mom for being the devoted wife, life partner, and caregiver that she's been for Dad, not only for his first 70 years, but especially the last 50, as his health decline and demands on her increased. She's a living example of God's love, and even though we always knew Dad would have not wanted his last years to be what they were, she's dedicated herself every day to making sure his last days were as comfortable as they could be. One of my oldest friends just simply tells me, your mother is the same. And for the hospice staff, just because Dad is gone doesn't mean that her free counseling services have to end. Come by or call anytime for advice, and you'll leave with soups and pies and casseroles. I want to share another story about Dad that really didn't fit in this narrative, but to me it represents a lot about him. I was about 12, I think, and we went as a family to the old Walmart on 78 Highway one Saturday night. And we drove into the parking lot and we're looking for space, and we saw a young man, maybe 25 or so, just beating the pulp out of an older bald man. There was blood pouring down the man's face. Dad didn't even pull into a parking space. He slammed the car in park, jumped out of the car, and ran over there and pulled this kid off that older fella, pinned his arms behind him, and held him immobilized until the police got there. He just told us to stay in the car the whole time. He didn't have to intervene, but he saw somebody in trouble that needed help, and he jumped into action. Today, you might get shot doing that, but what I saw was my father as a hero helping somebody that was in desperate need, and I was never prouder to be his son. It's probably fitting that Dad will be laid to rest only a few hundred yards from the school where he spent 30 years as a teacher, coach, administrator, and where the field is named for him. In case you didn't know, it's also probably less than a half mile straight through the woods from the house where we have lived since 1971. Mom said that one day, after he was bedridden, about 2 years ago, Dad looked up at the pictures on his wall and said, "Mo, was I a football player?" And she said, "Yeah, you were, and a really good one." And he looked at the photos and said, "I don't think I want to play anymore." And she said, "Well, you don't have to." On March the 9th, God and Dad decided that his game had ended and it was time to go. We already miss his smile, his wit, and his funny disposition. And I want to be honest, Clay and I hit the parent lottery. and our kids and grandkids are incredibly blessed. I'll get through this. He loved country music and singing along with his records at home or 8-track tapes in the truck. So I thought I would close with the words of a song by George Strait that I ran across recently. It says, "Let me tell you a secret about a father's love. A secret that my daddy says was just between us. You see, daddies don't just love their children every now and then. It's a love without end." Amen.